step into a world of relentless determination, unwavering focus, and a spirit forged in the crucible of adversity. Imagine the camera rolling, its lens capturing every bead of sweat, every moment of triumph and heartbreak. The story we're about to unfold is anything but ordinary. It swirls with tales of a childhood spent in the rugged backwoods of Arkansas, a young man's dream to break free from poverty, and a journey that ultimately redefined the essence of precision on the battlefield. This is the life and legacy of Carlos Hathcock, a name that sparks awe among marksmen and resonates with anyone who has ever dared to chase a goal against impossible odds. He was born in rural Arkansas, where the roads were little more than dusty paths and the nights were lit by fireflies flickering among the trees. In this corner of the American South, families often got by on the slimmest of means. Carlos grew up in a place that could be called humble at best, destitute at worst. With his father gone for work and his mother absent after divorce, the boy found himself under the watchful eye of his grandmother. She was tough in the way only people who have survived hard times can be. Someone who knew how to stretch a dollar, how to forage in the wild, and how to pass on survival instincts that would one day save her grandson's life. From a young age, Carlos learned to hunt not because it was a casual pastime, but because it was a question of putting food on the table. Rabbits and squirrels were fair game, tiny targets that demanded a steady hand and sharp eyes. Imagine him out there, a wiry kid with a rifle longer than his arms, felt comfortable handling. Each trigger pull taught him a lesson: how to judge distance, how to adjust his aim for that slight breeze, how to stay perfectly still even when mosquitoes buzzed around his ears. Those hours in the woods weren't just about bringing home dinner. They were the earliest chapters in a personal field manual for stealth, patience, and accuracy. There was no official mentor, no strict regimen, only the primal need to survive. But little by little, shot by shot, he was becoming a marksman, setting a foundation that would one day make him one of the most feared snipers in history. And yet, this was no idyllic country life. When you live in poverty, you grow up quickly. Carlos's father sent money sporadically and appeared only in glimpses, like a cameo in an otherwise lonesome movie. His mother was almost a phantom. If the hardships weighed heavily on young Carlos's shoulders, he tried to hide it. Instead, he leaned into a growing sense of self-reliance. By the time he was a teenager, he'd developed a resilience beyond his years. The local folks would see him trudging through the woods at dawn, rifle slung across his back, or see him around the corner store with calloused hands that knew the value of hard, honest work. Life kept grinding forward, and soon Carlos took a job at a Little Rock concrete company as a teenager. If you've never hauled sacks of concrete or mixed the heavy sludge, it's easy to underestimate how physically demanding it can be. For Carlos, it was a trial by fire, a daily workout that tested his stamina and discipline. Every ache in his muscles, every hour spent in the sweltering Arkansas heat, became another step in building an endurance that went beyond just physical. It taught him mental grit, an unspoken lesson in how to endure discomfort without letting it break your spirit. In these teenage years, he also discovered a competitive streak that emerged every time he stepped onto the shooting range. Local shooting matches around town pitted him against older, more experienced marksmen. You can picture a cluster of seasoned shooters, some sporting well-worn rifles, others with custom grips and scopes, exchanging friendly taunts and analyzing the wind's direction before they took their shots. Then there was Carlos, smaller, quieter, and often overshadowed by these older folks. But from the very first contest, he proved that his aim was not simply luck. Time after time, .22 rifle in hand, He outshot men twice his age. Word of a teenage prodigy rippled through the community. People started to talk about how this kid, with barely a dime to his name, could put 5 bullets through a target's bullseye while everyone else was still fine-tuning their sights. But dreams of just being a local champion didn't satisfy him. He yearned for something bigger, a chance to escape poverty and carve out a distinct destiny. The U.S. Marine Corps beckoned like a beacon. If you asked him, he might say he felt a calling, an urge to serve his country. But beneath that patriotic pull, there was also a simple truth. Joining the Marines was a ticket out of the backwoods. In 1959, at just 17 years old, he lied about his age to enlist, an audacious gamble that would send him on a trajectory he could hardly imagine at the time. When he arrived at Camp Pendleton for initial training, he stood among rows of recruits from every corner of America. Drill instructors thundered orders. Boots pounded in synchronized marches. Obstacles had to be scaled and weapons disassembled, reassembled, and then tested on the range. In the middle of this organized chaos, Carlos's marksmanship glowed like a lighthouse in the fog. Where others struggled to hit distant targets, he nailed them with uncanny accuracy. His instructors took note. The word spread up the chain of command that this lanky kid from Arkansas could shoot the wings off a fly. Although basic training is designed to mold recruits into a uniform shape, shave their heads, make them march in step, Carlos stood out. His future, it seemed, would revolve around that rifle. Still, greatness requires more than raw talent. Sometime in those early Marine days, Carlos realized that training was his lifeblood. He started tinkering with unconventional methods to challenge himself. After official drills wrapped up, he'd take a rifle out to uneven terrain, set up moving targets, maybe using makeshift contraptions or simply waiting for the breeze to swing a metal plate, and test his ability to adapt to shifting variables. At the time, it might have seemed eccentric, even obsessive. But these sessions forged skills that would later prove invaluable. He didn't just want to be good at hitting stationary targets at predictable distances. He wanted to master the chaotic swirl of real-world conditions. By the time orders came for Vietnam, Carlos was ready, though nobody truly comprehends the horrors of war until they face them. Vietnam was a crucible of thick jungle heat, monsoon rains, and an enemy that knew the terrain intimately. Imagine stepping off a helicopter into a swirl of dust and rotor wash, the heavy air smelling of damp foliage and sweat. Marines patrolled twisting trails, wary of booby traps hidden beneath leaves. Even for a seasoned rifleman, the environment was punishing. Yet word traveled quickly across the ranks that there was a sniper among them, one so precise, so fearless, that both his allies and enemies whispered his name. Carlos had a habit of wearing a white feather in his bush hat, a bold, almost reckless statement. To him, it was a challenge to enemy snipers. If you want me, come and get me. His adversaries labeled him Long Trang, or White Feather, a moniker that carried an air of mystique. Vietnamese forces placed an exorbitant bounty on his head, $30,000, far above the usual $8,000 to $2,000 for other snipers. It turned him into something of a legend. Soldiers would trade stories of how the White Feather could disappear into the brush, only to reappear in your nightmares. Despite the looming threats, despite the knowledge that entire teams were gunning for him, Carlos seemed to dance on a razor's edge and come out unscathed. Each mission he undertook reinforced his legend. His spotters, men who often became his closest confidants, would speak of his near-supernatural patience. He could remain still for hours, eyes trained on a target area, waiting for the precise moment to take a single lethal shot. One of his most famous feats came in 1967 when he modified an M2 Browning machine gun by mounting a 10-power Untold scope on it, effectively turning a heavy machine gun into a sniper's tool. Under normal circumstances, this would be written off as a bizarre experiment, but in Carlos's hands it resulted in a record-breaking kill at 2,500 yards, a distance so great that it bordered on the surreal. In an era before modern ballistic computers and fancy rangefinders, he relied on experience and feel. The bullet took what felt like an eternity to reach its mark, but when it did, history was made. That record stood until 2002, a testament to a shot taken by an intuitive genius, not a mere soldier. There were also times when his life hung by a thread. Tales from those who served alongside him paint an almost cinematic picture. Once he crawled so close to an enemy encampment that a North Vietnamese soldier literally stepped on him, unaware a lethal threat lay just inches beneath his feet. Another story speaks of a mission in the jungle where a bamboo viper bit him, delivering venom that threatened to kill him before he could return to base for the anti-venom. It was always a fine balance between the predator and the prey, and sometimes the difference came down to a single stroke of luck. In 1969, Carlos's luck seemed to run out when a landmine explosion severely injured him. Shrapnel tore into his body, leaving him with burns that covered a large percentage of his skin. Doctors told him he might never walk again, a crushing blow to someone whose entire identity was wrapped up in physical prowess and sharpshooting. But in typical fashion, he refused to accept defeat. The long months of recovery were excruciating, both physically and mentally. Skin grafts, physical therapy, the heartbreak of hearing that he was unfit to return to Vietnam. It all weighed on him. Yet slowly and painfully, he regained the ability to walk. His new battlefield would not be the jungles of Southeast Asia, but the sniper schools back home, where he would train the next generation. Back in the UST, he became an instructor at Quantico. Some might see it as a demotion, a step away from the action, but training future snipers allowed him to channel his hard-earned lessons, his love for the craft, into the budding careers of young Marines. He emphasized discipline, patience, and respect for the weapon and the target. He showed them how to adapt, how to endure, and how to cultivate the mental toughness that turns a decent shot into a deadly sniper. Although part of him longed to be back in the field, he threw himself fully into this new role. It was a bittersweet existence. The man who once thrived on the adrenaline of combat now found solace in forging new champions. If we zoom in on his personal life, we find complexities that rival any action on the battlefield. His relationship with his father was never fully mended. His mother's absence remained a gap in his emotional world. Grandmother was the anchor during his formative years, and though religion didn't factor heavily into his adult conversations, her moral compass shaped him in ways he might not have openly acknowledged. Marriage came in the form of Joe, a devoted partner he met at a Marine Corps event. Their relationship was tested almost immediately by the demanding nature of military life. Long deployments, the constant specter of danger, and the emotional fallout that war leaves behind. Carlos's injuries and the subsequent battles with depression were immense tests for the couple. He was no longer the invincible figure who had prowled the jungles. Pain became a constant companion, and the frustration of limited mobility haunted him. Yet Joe, standing by her vow that she had married a Marine, not a patient, refused to let him wallow. Their home was far from peaceful. Arguments sparked by stress and trauma likely flared. But through it all, she remained the bedrock he could lean on, living proof that love can survive even the darkest chapters. Their son, Carlos III, affectionately called Sonny, grew up with the legend of a father who was both formidable and at times a quietly tormented soul. By the 1980s, Sonny followed in his father's footsteps by joining the Marines. He even served as a marksmanship instructor, carrying the Hathcock legacy into a new generation. Carlos rarely spoke of the grim realities of Vietnam with his son, shielding him from the nightmares that still haunted him, preferring instead to teach him the fundamentals of shooting and discipline, lessons that had once sustained his own youth. Yet life had one more harsh twist in store: multiple sclerosis. Diagnosed in 1975, the disease chipped away at Carlos's vitality, targeting his vision and coordination, the very attributes that had once defined him. It was a cruel irony that a man famed for his steady hands and razor-sharp eyes now had to contend with tremors and blurry vision. For years, he resisted a wheelchair, refusing to let the illness curb his independence. Friends recall him joking, in that trademark wry humor, that he could still shoot straighter than I can walk. But as the 1980s waned, MS tightened its grip, confining him more and more to the realm of memory and reflection. In what free time his health allowed, he sought solace in new hobbies. He took up shark hunting off the coast of Virginia Beach, employing crossbows or rifles to bring down these fierce sea predators. Locals whispered about the white-haired ex-Marine who'd once bagged a 12-foot tiger shark, likening the patience required for fishing to the patience demanded by sniper work. It seemed fitting. Once again, he was lurking on the periphery, waiting for the right moment, relying on the patience and precision that had become his trademark. Throughout his life, Carlos remained modest about his exploits. He rarely bragged, preferring to shine the spotlight on the achievements of his spotter or the younger Marines he mentored. In an era where some veterans penned books or became media personalities, he chose a quieter path. Perhaps it was a reflection of the old-school code he inherited from his grandmother. Never boast, never swagger, just do your job. As the 1990s rolled in, his health continued to spiral downward. Friends visited less frequently, not out of neglect, but because it was painful to see him restricted to a bed, his once nimble frame now frail. Joe and Sonny remained by his side, along with the occasional Marine brother who dropped by to share old stories. In those final weeks, he found small joys, listening to Hank Williams, recalling the dusty fields of Arkansas, or retelling the lighter moments he'd shared with fellow Marines when they weren't bracing for the next firefight. He passed in 1999 at the age of 56, leaving the world quietly, surrounded by a family that had seen him at his highest peaks and his lowest valleys. Yet his legend didn't end there. In the broader culture, his feats and mystique inspired fictional creations, most notably the sniper character Bob Lee Swagger in Stephen Hunter's novels, and later in the film adaptation Shooter. Carlos's legacy also stoked debates within the military community. Many believed he deserved the Medal of Honor for a 1969 rescue operation, bureaucratic red tape, and perhaps his own reluctance to boast delayed recognition. And it was only years later that he was finally awarded the Silver Star. That controversy became a symbolic testament to how, despite embodying the fiercest aspects of a warrior, he never felt entirely comfortable standing in the limelight. Maybe the most haunting aspect of his story lies in the emotional toll his actions took on him. While many heralded him as a hero, labeling him the deadliest sniper or the white feather, he was never entirely at peace with that title. The nightmares of war, moments where a single pull of the trigger ended a life, lingered. He was deeply affected by the loss of his spotter, a close friend named Burke, who died in Vietnam. Their bond was forged under the canopy of a dangerous jungle, scanning ridgelines for the glint of a rifle scope, crawling inches at a time to avoid detection. When Burke was gone, it left a shadow on Carlos's spirit that no accolade could fully erase. So what do we make of this man, of this story? On one hand, he was a raw embodiment of military excellence, a sniper whose feats continue to awe professionals and enthusiasts alike. On the other, he was a humble figure shaped by poverty and anchored by a grandmother's rugged wisdom. He found his calling in the Corps, ascended to mythic status on the battlefields of Vietnam, and then returned home to wrestle with injuries, trauma, and a degenerative disease. His life was marked by physical and emotional scars, but also by an indomitable will that refused to yield, no matter the odds. Those who trained under him at Quantico speak of his strict standards. He wasn't one to let students skate by on average performance. Every shot had to have a reason, every movement a purpose. He'd tell stories, brief ones, always leaving out the goriest details about how in a real operation you might only get one chance. And if you messed up, it wasn't just your life at stake, but the lives of those who trusted you to watch their backs. That sense of moral and tactical responsibility is something that, ironically, only a deeply compassionate person might carry. Contradictions define Carlos's legacy: the lethal sniper who cared profoundly about saving lives, the revered warrior who tried to dodge the spotlight, the champion marksman whose strongest battles were fought not on the front lines but in the aftermath, back home. In the larger scheme of American military history, Carlos Hathcock remains a prominent figure, but his name may not be as widely recognized among casual observers as some Hollywood icons or sports legends. Yet for those in the know, serious students of marksmanship, dedicated Marines, or fans of sniper lore, he's almost an otherworldly figure. Over the years, he has featured in books, documentaries, and endless discussions on online forums. Each retelling tries to capture the magic, or at least the essence of what made him so special. Reflect, too, on the timeline of his life. If he'd grown up in a different era, say with access to modern sports shooting equipment, professional coaches, or advanced medical care for his MS, who knows how his story might have changed? Perhaps he would have become an Olympic marksman rather than a war hero. Perhaps the lethal burdens he carried would have been replaced by trophies and applause. Instead, fate and circumstance led him through the gauntlet of Vietnam and shaped him into a symbol for the complexities of war, the darkness and the valor, the skill and the suffering. It is no small feat to compress such a life into a single narrative. The man who hunted sharks off Virginia Beach was the same boy who once hunted squirrels in Arkansas for dinner. The Marine who wore a white feather to taunt enemy snipers was the same father who protected his son from painful war stories. The teacher at Quantico who demanded perfection was the same patient who would not admit defeat to multiple sclerosis. Each fragment forms part of an unforgettable mosaic. Fans of sniper lore might point to his record-breaking shot and celebrate it as the hallmark of his career, but those who truly appreciate his story often cite his sense of honor, his devotion to his fellow Marines, and his humility as his defining traits. The white feather was more than a lethal ghost in the tree line. He was a man grappling with responsibility, survival, and, ultimately, mortality. If there is any lesson to be gleaned from Carlos's life, it's that greatness can emerge from the most unassuming origins. Poverty and hardship sharpened his focus. Military discipline refined his raw talent. War tested his courage, but also scarred him in ways that never fully healed. Yet until his final breath, he never let adversity dictate his fate. He adapted, he persevered, and he imparted knowledge to others so they might carry on what he began. How can someone be so deadly yet so humble? Was he a hero, a product of his time, or some combination of both? The complexity of Carlos Hathcock's life defies simple labels. He remains a figure who invites both admiration and reflection. He reminds us that heroes can be flesh and blood, bearing wounds both visible and invisible, and that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in the silent spaces of our own hearts and minds.